Housekeeping.
Well, we've got another title to add to the long list of video games brought out of cult classic obscurity and back into semi-relevance, with Night Dive Studios' latest remaster for a game called Killing Time. A game where you explored a creepy, abandoned island to try and recover an Egyptian artifact that had caused all the inhabitants to go missing. It was a really bizarre first-person shooter, and one that's almost going on 30 years old now.
Why do you say that?
Originally released exclusively for the 3DO, but then also getting a remake of sorts a year later on the PC, and one that's also arguably better in some pretty key ways. So I was pretty interested in checking this one out, considering it's one of the few shooters from that era that I never actually played, which also meant that I had more or less zero expectations. However, what I'd soon come to learn is that Killing Time Resurrected has taken elements from both of these games. It's taken the level design and the overall map from the PC version, but then it's combined it with the sprite work and some other visual elements from the 3DO, which is probably for the best considering the PC version replaced all those digitized photo sprites with crappier looking pre-rendered ones. But then also because the level design and the overall gameplay on that 3DO version was absolutely horrible, having a map that was just complete nonsense. I mean, on the PC, the entire thing feels like a sensibly connected series of environments, from the various exterior areas on the island, like the hunter's cabin, the forest, and the lighthouse, through to all those other areas inside the estate itself. Whereas on the 3DO, the whole thing was really just one big giant maze, barely making any kind of sense, as if the person who designed it was a dyslexic lunatic. So bringing back the best aspects of each version, being the more appealing art style, combined with the more sensible level design, has made this remaster without a doubt the best possible outcome. Along with this remaster again being jam-packed with lots of cool little behind-the-scenes documents for those people who are really into that stuff.
Cool. Yeah, it is cool.
It's actually all kind of similar to Power Slave, where you had two vastly different versions of the same game. On the PC, you had a more standard run-and-gun shooter running on a modified version of the build engine. And then on the consoles, you had a full-on Metroidvania Lite, going back to old levels and collecting new items and upgrades. And just like Power Slave, Killing Time even has a whole Egyptian theme going on as well, with even similar mechanics where enemies are going to drop health essences when they're killed. Now, as for the story, the basic gist is that you're playing as an unnamed Egyptologist, heading to the Conway estate, which is on an island in the middle of nowhere, to investigate an ancient artifact called the water clock that's gone missing. As it turns out, something has gone horribly wrong, and you eventually discover that a rich heiress named Tessa Conway has taken part in some kind of ancient ritual with the artifact, in some kind of an attempt to extend her life. Only instead what this has done is turn all the inhabitants on the island into zombies or other horrific creatures, along with making all of her friends seemingly disappear. So it's your job now to set everything right, which involves exploring the entire island and recovering all of Tessa's remains, which are scattered into different vessels. Almost all of these are kept behind one of the game's many locked doors, which are all color-coded by the way, and as you'd expect, that was a complete nightmare for someone like me who's hopelessly colorblind. And then to rub further salt into that genetic lottery wound, this makes up 99% of what you're going to be doing throughout the campaign. Yeah, just running around and trying to find the 10 or so keys in total. In fact, the only other item you have to find is an RSVP, so that a ghostly butler will let you into the estate.
Welcome to the Conway Estate.
But apart from that, you're really just going around the island hunting for more keys than Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine put together.
Thanks. Maybe I'll need it.
Anyway, once you found all of these vessels, you can then head back to the estate and then try to destroy this contraption that's caused the whole mess. And yeah, like the whole thing seems pretty straightforward at first. You know, like it's just your standard ancient ritual that's gone horribly wrong. But the further you get into the story, you'll really start uncovering more of what actually happened. There were all these ghostly visions you can watch in real time throughout the levels.
What makes you think that Tess is going to go along with it?
Which really is just like a great example of gaming from that period in the 90s, where CD-ROMs were becoming much more commonplace, and as a result we started to see way more games take advantage of all that extra capacity, shoehorning in this kind of FMV stuff whenever they could. I mean, yeah, like don't tell me that we've all forgotten Mega Race.
I hate it when they ruin the suspense.
So considering that the 3DO was a disc-based platform, makes total sense that they do the same thing there as well, which is why there's dozens of these little video sequences you can watch in total.
How about a drink?
Ooh, I'd love one.
With there also being 7 different characters all up here as well, who've all got their own motives and reasons for being on the estate, which develops and changes the further you get. Obviously at the heart of the whole thing is Tess and a quest to try and use this artifact to live forever.
Gather my spiritual essence from the different symbols which lie around this island.
But then there's also this whole other subplot about this bloke named Duncan, who's trying to marry into the family and use Tess's money to finance his bootlegging operation.
This is only the beginning.
You also get to see all the discussions her friends have behind her back, where they're really worried about her well-being. But then you also see the shit that's going on in their lives as well, and how they're all just pretty miserable given the circumstances. So overall, this stuff is really kind of impressive for the time. Not to mention, a pretty pioneering method of storytelling, especially for the genre, letting the player learn more and more details through exposition, but then without taking them out of the game and killing the immersion. Even just in the way that you can more or less explore this entire island without any interruption. I mean, you might get a slight loading delay when you enter a new area, but it's still just this huge connected environment that you can run from one end of the other two in real time. It's really the kind of thing that would become much more standard the further the genre developed, especially with games like Half-Life really upping the ante and making that kind of approach to world building and storytelling more or less the norm. Plus, I also see it as an early precursor to games like Half-Life 2. You know, where you kind of stand around as this silent spectator, watching people devolve crucial and not so crucial information.
I couldn't have asked for a finer volunteer.
But it's also too one of the most impressive elements when you're looking at the remaster, just in the way of how much better these effects look now as well, especially considering how crappy it looked back in that PC version.
Help me. Please. Help me. Please.
Not bad. Not bad at all.
So according to Night Dive, like what they've done here is use a combination of AI to upscale certain videos, along with then manually painting back in all the details so things still look sharp and crisp. Or in other instances, just creating entirely new assets from scratch, which for like a remaster of a game that only 12 people ever played, sure does show a whole lot of dedication. The only thing that I do find kind of weird here is just how odd tonally the whole thing feels. I mean, there's times here when the game can be genuinely dark and spooky with really eerie music in the background. But then the sheer goofiness of some of the enemy designs, combined with some of the other music, just has this whole tonal whiplash effect. When you enter a new area, the music's going to usually change to reflect that you're in a new section of the island. And the shift that happens there sometimes is so sudden and out of place that it's almost like you've just started playing an entirely different game.
Yeah, boy.
Then again though, like this game has always tried to define itself as comedic horror, so yeah, like if nothing else, it still does fit into that genre. As for the shooting and the movement controls, well, that stuff's also pretty standard fare, and it's about as 1995 as an FPS is ever gonna get. For melee weapons, you've got a crowbar, which really shows us as well that these guys totally stole that same idea from Half-Life. Along with another melee weapon in the form of a knife. Neither of which are really all that handy though, so it's the ranged weapons you're going to use the most. Starting with the revolver, which you'll probably use for all of 5 minutes until you've found the shotgun. Simply because from that point on, the shotgun is going to be the weapon you'll be using maybe 99% of the time. Not only is it really effective, killing most enemies in 2 or 3 shots, but shells for this thing also seem to be much more abundant. You do get a second revolver as well though, and it is a scientific fact that using 2 guns at once does make something about 300% cooler. But even then, it's not that likely you're going to be using these, considering the revolvers use the same ammo as the Tommy gun.
A Tommy gun!
And yeah, like, would it really be a 1930s themed video game if it didn't have one of these things? I think as well that this might actually be the first FPS to ever feature a Tommy gun, even beating Blood to the punch by a couple of years. And to make it even cooler, your character holds this thing one-handed, showing off that raw Sigma energy by somehow minimizing all of the recoil. After that, you've got the flamethrower, which kind of feels like a combination of the plasma rifle in Doom, and then what the life leaf would eventually become in Blood. And this thing fires out a short burst of fireballs before needing like half a second or so to recharge. Oh yeah, and speaking of burning shit to the ground, you've also got the Molotov cocktails. And again, like, I think this might be one of the earliest, if not the first times this weapon's ever popped up in an FPS. I mean, I'm pretty sure that Terminator Future Shock had Molotov cocktails, but even there, they were far less common than they are in Killing Time. Plus, there's also like a really cool little detail here, where if you shoot the bottles instead of picking them up, they'll ignite instead and can damage nearby enemies. Then finally, we've got what's more or less Killing Time's BFG with the Ankh, which drops lightning down on pretty much every enemy on the screen, killing them instantly. And again, like, if I can just draw another Power Slave comparison, this is a weapon that's very similar to the Manacle. So while it does still feel like it's copying the whole pistol, shotgun, and chain gun archetype that really was commonplace around that time, you can still see those few elements of creativity sneaking in here. But what is absolutely Killing Time's biggest strength though is the sheer amount of enemy variety on offer, and at least visually this has to be one of the wackiest shooters I think I've ever played. Outside of maybe Grezzo 2, I can't think of many other titles that have this many different things for the player to shoot at. So given that the game's supposed to be set during the Prohibition era, and the island's been set up as a temporary holding point for all this illegal booze, you'll start off by coming up against these zombified bootleggers armed with Tommy guns. And then not too soon after that, you're coming up against groundskeepers armed with gardening shears, along with two-headed poodles and shotgun-wielding game hunters. There's even what I think is supposed to be demonic ducks wandering around as well. But that's really only scratching the surface. Because apart from that, you've got what's more or less Frankenstein's monsters. There's giant wasps, giant beetles, cockroaches that shoot fireballs, and then skeletons. Along with bats, which for some reason sound like monkeys when you shoot them. Then inside the estate itself, you'll take on housekeepers, chefs, old ladies who throw bottles at you, and then clowns. Yeah, clowns that apparently seem to be tickling the player to death. As well as what's probably my favourite, for no particular reason, with all the various chambermaids who run around with their weaponised cleavage and gargoyle wings. I mean, I've had worse. Oh yeah, and how can I forget all the stuff in the sewers, against what's more or less just giant piles of reanimated feces. I mean, look man, if it's supposed to be something else, by all means, someone tell me. But as far as I can tell, like, these things right here are just big old piles of shit.
It's a big old frozen chunk of shit.
There's a lot of great gore effects here as well when shooting up these enemies. The bootleggers, for instance, have this really cool animation where they fall to the ground when they're killed, riddled with bullets and still firing their Tommy gun into the air as they collapse. And then the chefs have their heads more or less explode like a champagne cork. It's just classic 1990s sprite work, being comical, violent, but also completely charming. And being able to see all of this stuff at a much higher resolution lets you appreciate all the work that originally went into it. But either way, like, this is a huge improvement over the soulless, pre-rendered crap that we got in that original PC version. The only thing it all has going against it is the way these enemies behave, because there's really not that much difference between any of them. Now, I like to think you can compare the enemy types in Killing Time to those in Doom, with there being the zombie men, the pinky demons, the imps, and then the cacodemons. So in the case of the Pinky Demons, like, these are just your standard melee enemies that run around and try to attack you when you get too close. The Imps are the ones that can fire off some kind of projectile from a distance, and then the Cacodemons are the same, only they're able to fly as well. And then finally the Zombie Men are the ones that shoot you with ranged weapons. And that's kind of the problem though, is that despite having so many different enemies in total, pretty much all of them are just a variant of one of those basic archetypes. The most annoying ones by far are these weird semi-transparent heads that just hover around and fire at you. But that's also a good example to highlight, because despite there being another version of them as well, which looks like a floating Anubis head, both of these more or less require the exact same strategy. Just kind of means that the shooting becomes very repetitive very quickly, especially considering as well just how high the enemy count can be in certain areas. Tessa's remains can also act as power-ups you can use a few times throughout the game, but these make the combat even easier, especially with things like the infinite ammo and God mode. I mean, if you keep in mind that this stuff was originally intended for a 3DO controller, or someone primarily playing with a keyboard, well, the complete ease of the combat now does start to make a bit of sense. But it doesn't change the fact that playing this now at a high resolution, with mouse aim and super smooth controls, has really turned the whole thing into a bit of a cakewalk. The other thing that's kind of hard to not bring up is just how boring the level design can feel at times as well, because all you're really doing is just running around and trying to find that next key. There is a bit of flexibility at least in how you can explore the island, and you don't have to do everything in a completely preset order. But it still can kind of lock you up for a bit if you're missing that one key that's locking the door into an area that you haven't explored yet. The lever design is also very focused on flipping levers, and missing one of these things can have you going around in circles for like 15 or 20 minutes. And considering that the lever design doesn't do the best job here of trying to draw your eyes to these things, can make it a bit more tedious as well. But then again, I mean, them's kind of the breaks. You know what I mean? Considering this is something from back in 1995. Back when games were made to be confusing, but almost kind of on purpose, to really make sure that the player got as much bang for their buck as possible. So I guess kind of like sitting here and bitching about a 1995 game, feeling like a game from 1995, really probably is about as dumb as jumping into a pool and complaining about getting wet. Or spending a night with your mum and complaining about ending up with herpes.
Schwacked.
Overall, I'd say that Killing Time on the whole is remarkably accurate to its namesake. And I know that the title is a reference to the story and the whole MacGuffin quest and all that stuff, but on a more basic level, it's the perfect thing to call something, which really serves as a great way to help someone just kill a few hours if they've got nothing else to play. There are two different endings here, both a good and a bad one, but you can easily see both of these by just reloading your save file before the final boss fight. You'll also probably end up getting almost all of the achievements in a single playthrough, at least outside of one of them that requires beating the whole thing in less than 2 hours. But a second playthrough is going to easily top that one off without a hitch. Is this thing any kind of timeless masterpiece or hidden gem? Well, like, not really, but it is a pretty solid shooter from around that time when the genre was really burgeoning. Along with it being a great example of when gaming was shifting into those disc-based titles, and how that technology was being implemented more and more.
This is only the beginning.
So I think the main thing that's going to turn a few people off here is just going to be whatever price Night Dive Studios choose to sell it for. Some people might say that it's a bit of a shame that there's no way to play both the PC and 3DO versions separately, but look, trust me, after having played that 3DO version for a couple of hours, we are far better off with what we've gotten here. And look, if you're that worried about playing it for yourself, well, emulation is still a thing that exists. Either way though, this remaster has done exactly what it needed to do, which is to introduce an almost 30-year-old game to a completely new audience, along with making it vastly more accessible, which at the end of the day is all they had to do. So let me end this review the way that I end almost all of my Night Dive Studios videos, by asking them, yet again, to get around to remastering Alien Trilogy and No One Lives Forever.